Well, there have been lots and lots of changes in the church in my lifetime. And the first significant one was when the balconies were taken away. There used to be 2 balconies, one either side, in both of the side chapels. And they were taken away in 1926. The wood, or some of the wood from them, was used to make the candlesticks, the tall candlesticks at the high altar. Going back to the balconies, there's a staircase on the north side, or still there, and there was a similar one on the south side, which actually fed up to the balconies. At the same time as this, electricity was installed in the church. I've always understood that it was the first building in the town to have electricity, certainly one of the first. And before that, of course, the church had been lit by gas. And the organ, which of course is electric now, was hand pumped. Dean Bayard came here as vicar in the early 1930s, 1932 I think it was, 1933. And he brought the church to life in Newport, and all sorts of things happened. First of all, the Lady Chapel and Transfiguration Chapels were installed. The free will offering scheme was started, and it sounds absolutely ludicrous nowadays, but the usual amount of giving was 6pence or a shilling in old money per week. He introduced vestments for the priest. Before that, for communion services and for other services as well, they'd just worn a cassock and surplice. The family communion was begun, and that started at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. Before that, the main services on a Sunday were matins, which was at 11, and at 6 o'clock in the evening. At matins, nearly all the shopkeepers used to come. I used to come as a child from Sunday school, and the Sunday schools then were held in the riverside schools, which have disappeared long ago, down by the river, down the hill on Ousbank Street. And we used to come in until the sermon and sit along the north side of the church, and then we used to go out before the sermon started. But that was the main service of the day. But as I say, Bayard started the 9 o'clock, and that became very popular. Round about the same time, the pulpit was moved. When I was a child, well, a young person, the pulpit was exactly where I'm sitting now. And then it was moved halfway between here and where it is now. And here, the pews came up to about a yard from the screen. There was just a pathway round, but they were taken away and moved back. And as I say, the pulpit was put halfway between where it is now and where I'm sitting. Some of the pews were stored in riverside schools and were later used, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. At this time, there was a lot of music went on in the church. The organist was Kenneth Garrett, and he was Mr. Music in North Bucks. And there was a large choir, and once or twice a year we used to have choral concerts in the church, doing oratorios. The choir then, on those occasions, was augmented by the Choral Society from Wolverton. And they were quite grand occasions. We used to have soloists, professional soloists come, and the church used to be absolutely packed. Again in the 1950s, the large stove which heated the church, which stood right at the back, quite near the font, was removed. That used to heat the church, and it had to be stoked up times during the weekend. The radiators and heating system was installed, and it was fuelled at first by coke, then by oil, and then by gas. before the present boiler was put in fairly recently. At some point during the 1950s, and I can't tell you when, the small pinnacles of the tower were removed. They became damaged, and there used to be 4 big ones that are there now, and 4 small ones in between them, but they were removed at that time. And round about the same time, but it's all a bit vague now, I'm afraid, Death Watch beetle was found in the roof, and that had to be dealt with. During the 1950s, the church was rewired. We had a television service of the 9:30 service done, and at that time apparently the wiring wasn't sufficient for television cameras and whatnot, and the church was rewired, and a tomb was found in the north porch, which of course was unearthed again when the recent work was done in the porch, and quite a lot of work had to be done to do that. After the rewiring, the lights in the church were changed, and the present lights shades were put on, and there was lots of rude remarks about these when they were put in, and people said they looked like milk bottles. But we've got used to them over the years, and I don't think anybody objects to them now. And the spotlights in the chancel were also installed at the same time. Round about this time, the gravestones from the churchyard were removed so that it was made easier to keep the place tidy. And some of those gravestones were put in front of the nave altar in the sanctuary here, and the rest, of course, were put outside the church and made a pathway along the south side. Before that, teams of men every now and again used to have to weed this. I've got a photograph at home of 4 of the men from the CEMS, the Church of England Men's Society, who were busy weeding this on a Saturday morning. Several times, of course, during this time, money had to be raised to restore the stonework of the church and the roof. There was always an appeal of some sort going on, and there was a big appeal in 1990 for the stonework. The tower particularly, and some of the other round the windows was in bad condition, and that had to be done. Work has been done too on the carillon over the years to make that workable. And part of this, in the 1970s, was done by 4 men from who worked at Sogeniques, and they used their skill in getting the carillon back to work again. To go back to the 1950s, the south porch was restored in those days in memory of Dennis Lyne, who was a proprietor of the Buck Standard when he was alive. More recently, of course, the north and south aisles have been painted, and that's been a big improvement because they were getting into a bad condition. Lots and lots of things have been done, not necessarily big changes, but improvements all along the line. And now, of course, we've just had the West End done, and that is a big improvement. It's lovely to come into the church and feel that the porch is welcoming and clean and white and nice and bright. It used to be such a dingy hole, and now it really welcomes you in. And, of course, the changes in the tower have made a lot of difference. So it goes on all the time. It all takes money, of course, but there we are.
Life was very hard in the 1930s, and the effects of the Depression were very evident. My first memories as a small boy was going to St Lawrence Church, Great Linford, and with my grandmother, and we used to walk across the fields from Broad Street, where I lived, up through past the allotments. There were no houses in Annesley Road or the Usedale School, of course, and we used to walk across by the canal, the swing bridge, and to the church. And in the bad weather, we used to go on the bus. The organist and choir master at St Peter's and Paul's Church was Kenneth Garrett, and he let it be known that he wanted more choir boys. He actually did this by approaching the schools, and he stipulated that the boys must be 8 and they had to read well. And I was only 7, but I could read well, and I was accepted along with other boys. The choir was an all-boys affair, and Kenneth Garrett taught us well. War loomed, and the Reverend Bayard organised special services of worship and prayers. The windows in the church were blacked out, and very little light was available. So what used to happen, that most of the services, of course, were held in the daytime. But there were certainly, particularly in the time of crisis, when the country was in trouble, we had an evening service then. And the pulpit, of course, at that time was by the screen, and the choir boys could see exactly what was going on with the preacher. And there was the vicar at this particular time giving his sermon, just one light so you could see his notes, and down came the biggest spider from the roof down and landed onto his surplice. And we all sat there as choir boys, quite amused. Choir boys were expected to, of course, come to practice. We had services on Sunday at 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and at 6 o'clock for evening song. And they were quite strict. We had to attend if at all possible. The church building was dull, and the pulpit was by the screen, and it was heated by a large boiler at the west end of the church, which was fueled by coke. Far removed from the situation we are back to act at the present time. The chancel was used by the choir, and all the services were conducted from the high altar. Before the end of the war, my grandmother died, and I had to move to Bedford for a few months. But when I returned, I became a server under J.J. Williams. He was high church, and I did enjoy the ritual very much. But then I suppose I've been brought up as a traditionalist through all those other years, and hence was at ease. The 60s, with such large congregations, brought many developments. 1967, we had a restoration year, and we saw the interior encased in scaffolding. The roof was redecorated, the apostles were coloured and gold-leafed. And I remember the coat of arms at the entrance to the chancel was lowered, and a parishioner named Arthur Hackett, who in fact worked in the railway works as a painter who used to paint the World coaches, he in fact redecorated the coat of arms. And you've only got to look today and see exactly what a good job he made of it. It's as good as the day it went up those many, many years ago. At the end of the redecoration, the reordering of the church took place. The choir was moved from the chancel down into the nave, as it is today, and Hewitt Newcomb, church warden, made a superb altar to be located, I should say, outside the screen, which is where it is today. And it was at this time, in fact, that the pulpit was relocated to its present position. I was appointed Vicar's Warden in 1969 and worked alongside her at Newcombe. We both retired together, and following a confirmation service, the Bishop of Dorchester presented her and myself with paintings and thanked us for our work. During our period as Church Warden, the social and fundraising activities were well supported. I recall volunteers actually building a stage in the belfry and turning all of the pews, heavy as they are, round the other way. And we staged Benjamin Britten's Noah's Flood, which involved members of the congregation, outside singers and performers, and mainly the children from the school. They had actually made all their costumes of the animals, because obviously it was the animals going 2 by 2 towards, and they put their costumes on in the vestry, and in the music they came down from through the chancel into the nave, over the stage, out the other door, the west door, ran round the side of the church, changed their costumes to something else, and continued the stream, and it was absolutely wonderful. A great success, ran for about a week, or nearly a week. That was the sort of various activities we did. A, to raise money, of course, and secondly, of course, to be noticed as a church and our involvement with the town. In the course of the year, for some years actually, we used to do special plays, stage erected where the altar is, and we put on nativity plays, epiphany plays, plays for Lent and Easter. A wonderful atmosphere enjoyed by the congregation and a lot of members of the parish. At one stage, all the choir robes wanted changing. They were many, many years old and getting ragged. And we decided to raise the money for those, and we had a scheme called surplus shillings. Many people will remember this, but basically it was a tombola. Had lots of people who collected the money, and we used to have a weekly draw following evensong at the vicarage, which was a social side of it, of course, and there was tea and cakes, and the main draw was made. We raised a lot of money, and this is the time that we actually changed from when we have in black cassocks to the red stroke maroon colour there is today, and we're using now. Another highlight of the year was John Crisp's time. He used to take members of the parish on a holiday, usually in Devon. It gave the opportunity to get to know each other, and there were some families in the town who couldn't afford a holiday at that time, and so it was double-sided. It worked very well. Lots of good memories, even from people now who can remember those holidays. He also took members of the choir to the service of remembrance at Albert Hall, and they were chosen few. There was very few places available, but they were taken down, joined the choir, which of course the Bishop of London conducts at that particular time, and that was a great privilege. Not many people will remember that the BBC actually came to Newport Pagnell and broadcast morning service, which was in J.J. Williams' time. it was my job then as a junior engineer to ensure that the electricity supply was not lost during transmission. And bearing in mind that the service went out live, quite a responsibility. I had to renew the cable into the church because they wanted additional power. And it was at this time when my workmen actually discovered the tomb under the north porch. The knowledge of the tomb being there was a great help when we came to put in the disabled and access in 2008. This development in the north porch brings to mind another interesting aspect of tombs and coffins. I was responsible to reinforce the electricity mains to the north side of the High Street, and in doing so I commissioned a new substation in the library car park, and new cables were laid between the substation and O'Dow's. Whilst excavations were taking place, we came across many lead coffins and a few bones, which came to show, or proved rather, that church passage was once part of the church yard. There's photographic evidence, of course, that large wrought iron gates were across the entrance by O'Dell's shop and the little shop that was demolished where the war memorial is now. That I feel was taken down sometime in the war years. Following my thoughts of the 1970s, the church tower needed money spending on it, and we decided we would raise £11,000 needed, which would cover the cost on two sides. And one of the ideas was to build a wishing well, and this was erected on a little triangular piece of ground by the north porch, and it was built in stone with a lich gate top, and hanging under the lich top, I should say, was a bell, and it was a real bell that was loaned by a farmer in Malso, and that was the bell which they used to ring at the farm to call the workers in from the fields. Very successful this was. There was a little sign erected just at the side which said, make your wish at the wishing well, throw a coin into the well, make your wish at the wishing well. Raised a lot of money. It was not vandalised or robbed during the whole year that it was in that position. Later the organ needed attention. Again, the church wardens initiated the fundraising. And this was another amazing thing about it. Though it was stripped down and all the pipes were laid in the north aisle, not one was vandalised and certainly not stolen. That's quite a difference to what would have happened, I'm sure, with the robbers who take lead off of the roofs at this present time. But many vicars and curates have come and gone, and the congregations have varied. In the 70 years that I've served Newport Pagnell Church, I have found that human nature being a fairly constant quality, that people and the happenings mentioned are neither phenomenal or unusual. I hope in some small way that the details related will be of some value to the inhabitants of Newport Pagnell, and perhaps help the town to realise the priceless legacy of the beauty of St. Peter's and Paul's Church. It is, after all, the oldest building in the town. And that they may feel an enhanced pride and interest in a church erected by our ancestors.
In 1937, when I joined the choir, there were 26 boys and about 10 to 12 men were making a really first-class choir. And you were only allowed to join the choir when you were 9 years of age. And then you had to sit at the far end here on 2 chairs until you gained your surplice. And then when other boys left, you were allowed to join these long benches here and sit there with two benches at the end for the top choir boys. The choir master was Mr. C. Kenneth Garrett, who was organist here and choir master for almost 50 years. And he placed a great deal of emphasis on the social side of the choir. And there used to be quite parties for the boys at Christmas time, and a visit to London Theatre for the men. And in the summer, the boys were taken by train on special trains to seaside places like Brighton. And we used to have tremendous water pistol fights up and down the corridors. But Ken Garrett was a brilliant musician. And he conducted from the organ oratorios like Messiah and Elijah, and he ran the choir in a most tremendous way. Before you joined the choir, at the age of 7, you were allowed to become a boat boy, which means that you carried this boat containing incense for the thurifer. And also you had the chance to serve the rector, or the vicar as he was in those days, at the early communion service here at the Lady Chapel. It was at some unearthly hour, probably about 7 o'clock in the morning. And I remember one of the first times I was there, Bert Beard, who was the sexton, came up with the arms and mumbled something like that. And I asked him to repeat it, and he said again, and so I turned round to the vicar and said, and he understood what I meant, but I certainly didn't till afterwards, when he explained to me that what he'd said was, there are 7 people present. I started learning ringing in 1942, and that was during the war years when I was 14. And Reg Howson, who was the tower captain, learned me to ring on this bell. But because it was wartime, there was a ban on church bell ringing because the bells could only be rung when the German parachutists arrived. So he tied the clapper up and the bell rang silently. And I was, and my friends, we were among the only ones in the district who learned to ring at that particular time. And we learned to ring the bell before we ever heard it actually clang. And this is the 4th bell, and there are 8 bells here, dating back over 250 years. And in the early days, they were used to help the local community. During the summer months, between March and November, the bell was rung at 5 o'clock in the morning, at 1 o'clock at lunchtime, and at 8 o'clock in the evening. The ringing was for 3 services on a Sunday, and also when anybody died, the tenor bell, which weighs just over a ton, was rung to denote that people had died. And what happened then was that the ringer would ring 3 times 3 on one of the lighter bells for a man, and 2 times 3 for a woman, and then ring the big tenor, toll it for the number of years. Now, we now have quite a good band of ringers, and they learn to ring. I'll show you how we ring. This has been a momentous year for the ringers. After waiting almost 70 years, they've at last got a ringing platform, which means that instead of having to ring from the floor with ropes 80 foot long, they now have a ringing platform, which means that the ring is much shorter and much easier to control. There are 8 bells, most of them over 250 years old. There are 9, really, 8 that are ringable. The 9th one was installed by Mr. F.J. Taylor, the local mustard manufacturer, in 1887 to mark the Golden Jubilee of Queen Victoria. The 9th bell enabled the carillon to play the national anthem and many other tunes.